The last M240 in the Ravelin is just jammed solid, and there are men climbing through the breach who have already decided this fort belongs to them by sunrise. Master Sergeant Ray Kessler racks the charging handle twice, feels the bolt refuse to seat, and does the only thing left to do. Drops the gun, draws his sidearm, and plants his boots in the rubble of a wall that has been standing since before Columbus crossed an ocean. Behind him, a night hospitaler in a blood-soaked black surcoat is screaming orders in Spanish that nobody left alive can follow anymore. In front of him, close enough now that Kessler can smell burnt gunpowder and unwashed wool, is a wave of men in tall white felt hats who have already broken this fort twice today and clearly intend to make the third attempt permanent. 18 hours earlier, none of this rubble existed, and the fort still had a roof. 18 hours earlier, the siege of Malta had already run 6 brutal weeks, and the small star-shaped fortress called Fort St. Elmo, a modest stone strongpoint guarding the mouth of the Grand Harbor, never designed to survive what was about to hit it, had already outlasted every reasonable expectation anyone on either side had for it. The Ottoman Empire had come to erase the Knights Hospitaller from the map entirely, sending an invasion force of roughly 40,000 men under the joint command of Mustafa Pasha on land and Piale Pasha at sea, backed by siege artillery heavy enough to crack limestone like eggshell. Days earlier, the Empire's most feared Corsair admiral, a man named Turgut Reis, had been killed outside these very walls by a splatter of rock thrown up when a cannonball struck too close, and the Ottoman command had responded to his death not with hesitation, but with fury, pouring even more men and iron into breaking the fort that killed him. Inside the walls, a garrison that history would eventually record as barely more than 150 knights and Spanish and Maltese soldiers, holding a position that Grand Master Jean Perisseau de Valette, commanding the main fortress of St. Angelo across the harbor, had already privately concluded could not be reinforced fast enough to survive. In the history nobody in this fort has read yet, every single man holding these walls dies here, to the last night, within days, a sacrifice that buys the rest of Malta the time it needs to eventually break the siege entirely, at a cost so total that Ottoman soldiers will supposedly find only a handful of half-drowned survivors floating in the harbor once the killing finally stops. At 2 a.m, in the smoking rubble of the fort's inner courtyard, the sky itself tears open with a sound like a cannon fired directly into a man's skull. 50 men fall out of a seam of electric blue light in 2 disciplined ranks, rifles already up, night vision goggles glowing faint green against the dark. A moment ago they were running a joint maritime raid rehearsal off the coast of Sicily. Now there's a half-collapsed limestone wall in front of them, the stench of old blood and gunpowder thick enough to taste, and beyond a breach in the outer defenses, the unmistakable orange glow of an Ottoman siege camp stretching along the shoreline as far as anyone can see. Comms are dead. GPS is a blank screen. The platoon's radio man doesn't bother masking the disbelief in his own voice. Sergeant Major, I don't think this is Sicily anymore. 5th Special Forces Group has just fallen 459 years out of its own war and landed directly inside the single bloodiest siege fortress in the history of the Mediterranean. A wounded Spanish soldier finds them first, sword raised with an arm that's clearly shaking from exhaustion and blood loss, and very nearly attacks before the strange black rifles and the calm, open hands make him hesitate long enough for a Maltese-speaking knight to arrive instead. The knight, young, hollow-eyed, his once white surcoat now more red than white, stares at 50 men in gear unlike anything forged by any smith on this island, and finally manages a single sentence in halting, broken Italian that the platoon's linguist barely translates fast enough. "Are you the reinforcements the Grand Master promised? Or has God simply run out of better ideas?" "Neither," Kessler answers through the translator, flat and even. "We're just here to make sure this fort doesn't die the way it's supposed to." The knight studies him for a long moment, with the particular exhaustion of a man who has stopped being surprised by anything, then simply turns and leads them toward the breach without another word. There's no ceremony left in this fort for ceremony. There's a wall about to fail, and 50 strangers willing to stand in the gap. And after 6 weeks of siege, that's the only introduction that matters to anyone still breathing inside these stones. Inside the fort's shattered interior, Kessler gets his first real accounting of what 50 men are actually working with, and the number is grim even before the math starts. 50 operators, each carrying an M4A1 carbine with 7 30-round magazines, 210 rounds per rifle, 10,500 rounds total across the entire platoon. 4 M240 machine guns round out the heavy weapons, each starting with 2,000 rounds of belted 7.62 ammunition, roughly enough brass laid end to end to stretch the length of 2 football fields. 3 Javelin missile systems came through with them, 3 shots total, and largely useless against stone walls and dispersed infantry alike. Better saved, Kessler quickly decides, for whatever massed formation eventually tries to pour through the main breach all at once. Night vision battery packs are rated for roughly 6 hours of continuous use before they go dark, and in Mediterranean summer heat with no resupply of any kind ever coming, water is the quietest killer of all. A 2-day supply, no more, for 50 men about to fight in stone that holds daytime heat like an oven. 10,500 rifle rounds, 8,000 rounds of belt-fed, 3 javelins, 40,000 men on the other side of that harbor, and a wall that's already half rubble before we even got here, Kessler says over the platoon net, cold and clinical. Run that math yourselves and tell me in the comments whether 50 of us was ever supposed to hold anything against numbers like that. He makes his first hard call within the hour, and it isn't the popular one. Rather than spreading the platoon evenly across the fort's entire perimeter, Kessler commits nearly 2/3 of his firepower to the single breach that Ottoman forces have already opened twice this week, betting that 100 smaller assaults spread thin across a mile of failing wall matter less than holding the one gap the enemy has already proven it can find fastest. Would you have concentrated everything on the known weak point, or spread the defense thin to cover every possible angle of attack? The first real test comes at dawn, when a company of janissaries, tall white Berg felt caps, long red caftans, matchlock muskets slung alongside curved yata'an blades, moving with the discipline of men who have taken fortresses across 3 continents, advances toward the breach in tight, practiced ranks, drums pounding a rhythm meant to break enemy nerve before a single shot is exchanged. Among them is a young musketeer named Yusuf, barely past his apprenticeship, carrying a matchlock his father carried at the siege of Rhodes decades earlier. He has heard whispers overnight about strange defenders glimpsed in the breach, dismissed by his sergeant as nothing more than desperate Spanish reinforcements slipped in under cover of darkness. Nothing this fort hasn't already bled through a dozen times this siege. He believes it, right up until the breach ahead of him erupts with a sound that has no place in his understanding of war. Imagine, for one impossible second, every matchlock in the entire Ottoman army fired in the same instant, over and over, without a single pause to reload or clear smoke. Yusuf watches the veteran directly beside him, a man who survived the fall of Rhodes and thought nothing left in this world could still frighten him. Simply drop. No visible wound, no cry. Gone between one step and the next. There is no cloud of gun smoke marking where the killing came from. No pause in the fire that any soldier could time and advance around. He drops flat on pure animal instinct and does not move again until the company breaks and scatters back toward the Ottoman lines, leaving perhaps 80 men behind in the rubble. 50 operators, 0 casualties. Ammunition expended, just under 700 rounds. And somewhere back in the Ottoman camp, word is already reaching Mustafa Pasha that the breach his men broke twice already this week has grown teeth overnight. Sitrep, 50 Green Berets standing, ammunition at 93%, 3 javelins untouched in reserve. The morning assault is broken, but an army that has already conquered Rhodes, Cyprus's approaches, and half the eastern Mediterranean does not stay confused about a setback for very long. Mustafa Pasha's response arrives before the sun reaches its highest point, and it is the response of a commander who has broken far stronger fortresses than this one by refusing to keep making the same expensive mistake. Rather than sending another frontal wave into the breach, Ottoman engineers redirect the full weight of the siege artillery, heavy bronze bombards already positioned along the shoreline, into a sustained, methodical bombardment aimed not at breaking through the breach directly, but at collapsing the walls flanking it, widening the gap from both sides at once, while sappers begin driving a mine shaft toward the fort's foundation under cover of the barrage's noise and dust. Kessler recognizes the shift in tactics almost immediately, the pattern of impacts walking steadily along the wall line rather than concentrating uselessly on already collapsed stone, and orders half his platoon rotated back from direct fire positions into the fort's interior, sheltering them from a bombardment that no amount of modern body armor is built to survive a direct hit from. It costs him presence at the breach exactly when Ottoman skirmishers probe forward again under cover of the barrage, testing whether the defense is actually thinned. Sitrep, 50 Green Berets standing, 0 casualties, ammunition at 86%. The bombardment has already opened 2 new cracks in the flanking walls. Somewhere beneath the rubble, faint and rhythmic, the sound of Ottoman sappers digging has started, and nobody in the fort has any way to know exactly how close that tunnel already is. By late afternoon, the fort's own stone has become as dangerous an enemy as the army outside it. The sustained bombardment finally achieves what 6 weeks of Ottoman effort had been building toward. A second breach opens along the northern wall, 20 meters from the first, forcing Kessler to split his already thin platoon across 2 collapsing fronts at once, with ammunition reserves that were never built to cover this much frontage simultaneously. 2 of the 4 M240 machine guns run at a sustained rate of fire no manufacturer ever designed them to survive, began failing within minutes of each other. One jamming on a round cooked half-fired by heat trapped in a chamber that has not been allowed to cool in hours. The other simply running its barrel hot enough to visibly glow, forcing an emergency swap under fire with gloved hands that can barely grip the metal. Gun 2's down. Gun 4's cooking rounds on its own now, the platoon's weapons sergeant reports, and there's no humor left in his voice at all. Until, a moment later, watching Ottoman sappers finally break through into a support tunnel only to be met by a small charge of C4 that collapses their own mine shaft on top of them. Someone on the net can't resist observing that an empire capable of building the pontoon bridges and siege trains that terrified half of Europe has just had its underground engineering corps outdone by men who considered demolition charges a Tuesday afternoon chore. Nobody laughs saying it. It gets said anyway, because saying it is easier than admitting how close that tunnel actually came to working. Sitrep, 48 Green Berets standing, 2 lightly wounded by falling debris, ammunition at 68%. 2 machine guns down, 1 under emergency repair. 2 active breaches instead of 1. The sun is dropping toward the horizon, and everyone inside these walls understands that Ottoman assaults, unlike Ottoman patience, tend to intensify rather than fade with the dark. The night assault, when it comes, is not a single wave. It is the largest push the fort has faced across the entire 6 weeks of siege, driven forward by Mustafa Pasha's explicit fury at the death of his best Corsair admiral, and the stubborn refusal of this pile of broken stone to finally fall the way every calculation said it should have days ago. Thousands of men converge on both breaches simultaneously under cover of darkness. Janissary musketeers in the front ranks, backed by wave after wave of Sipahi dismounted cavalry and irregular infantry driven forward by officers who have stopped counting the cost of taking this fort and started caring only about ending the humiliation of failing to. Kessler's remaining machine guns, down to their last reliable belts, burn through ammunition at a rate that has stopped being sustainable and become simply a countdown to silence. And the volume of fire coming from the walls visibly, audibly thins for the first time since the siege reopened at dusk. This is the moment from 18 hours in the future. This is the jammed M240, the sidearm drawn in the rubble, the wave of white felt caps close enough now to smell the burnt match cord on their weapons. Kessler commits his final javelin the instant the northern breach compresses into a dense enough mass to justify it, the missile turning a 15-meter stretch of packed Ottoman infantry into an instant catastrophic gap in the assault. But the southern breach, the one Kessler himself is standing in when his last working machine gun finally jams for good, does not have a javelin left to save it. There is only a sidearm, a wounded knight screaming orders nobody can follow, and men in tall white hats climbing through rubble that has already killed more soldiers on both sides than either army wants to count. The close quarters fight that follows lasts less than 2 minutes and feels, to every man inside it, like most of the night. Kessler puts 3 rounds through the chest of the first Janissary to clear the breach and drops him into the gap his own body just opened, buying seconds rather than safety. And it is only the arrival of 4 Rangers redirected from the collapsing northern fight, sprinting across open, shell-torn ground under fire that should, by every reasonable measure, have killed at least one of them, that finally closes the southern gap before it becomes a rout. Sitrep, 42 Green Berets still fighting, 6 wounded, 2 dead, the platoon's first losses of the entire engagement. Ammunition remaining, 11%. 0 javelins left. Both breaches are holding, barely, and for the first time all night, the drums beating from the Ottoman lines are calling for withdrawal rather than another push. Dawn over Fort St. Elmo arrives on a fortress that history never intended to still have living defenders standing inside it. Mustafa Pasha, watching from his own command position across the harbor, as the largest single assault of the entire siege collapses with catastrophic losses for no ground gained, makes the call that no version of this history was ever supposed to allow him to make. Rather than immediately renewing the attack, he orders a pause to reassess, unwilling to keep feeding men into a breach that has now cost him easily 2,000 casualties across a single brutal night, for a fortress that, by every rational military calculation, should already belong to him. The pause is not surrender. Malta's siege will grind on for weeks yet, and everyone standing in this shattered courtyard understands that. But it is time, real, unexpected, desperately needed time. And Kessler uses every hour of it to do what the version of this history he'll never read never got the chance to do. Organize an actual evacuation, moving the fort's most severely wounded knights and Spanish soldiers across the harbor to the relative safety of Fort St. Angelo, under cover of the Ottoman army's own exhausted retreat, rather than leaving them to die in a final assault that, this time, simply never comes. The cost was real, and nobody in the platoon pretends otherwise. 2 Green Berets did not survive the final night's fighting in the southern breach: Corporal Wade Ellison and Specialist Marco Torres, names that will mean nothing to anyone in this century, and everything to 15 families in a country not yet founded when this fort was first built. 6 more carry wounds serious enough to need the kind of care that does not exist anywhere within reach of this harbor. A night finds Kessler near the northern breach in the pale morning light, the young man's surcoat now more red than white, staring at a fortress that, in every account he'd already resigned himself to writing in his own head, was supposed to be his tomb by now. "We were meant to die here," he says slowly, working through a thought that clearly doesn't fit comfortably into words yet. "Every knight in this fort made his peace with it weeks ago. I do not know what it means to have been wrong." "It means some of your men get to go home instead of into the history books," Kessler answers. "That's the whole job today." There is no triumphant celebration echoing through the courtyard. There is only the flat, exhausted quiet of men who held a fortress the entire war expected to become a mass grave, and the grim knowledge, sitting heavy on every survivor, of exactly what 2 names on that list actually cost to make the difference. The portal reopens at midday, the same violent seam of blue light tearing open in the fort's ruined courtyard. The young knight offers a formal bow with his sword reversed, blade toward himself, in a gesture of respect that needs no translation. Kessler returns a simple, modern salute, and 42 exhausted men, 6 wounded on improvised stretchers, step through a light that asks no permission, leaving behind a fortress that history insists should already be a mass grave, and is instead, improbably, still holding. Because Fort St. Elmo does not fall to the last man the way the history everyone else remembers insists it must, the ripple spreads outward across the remaining weeks of the siege in ways no chronicler on either side could have anticipated. The evacuated knights and soldiers, rather than dying in the fort's final collapse, lived to reinforce the harbor's main defenses at Fort St. Angelo, a modest but real addition of experienced, battle-hardened men at exactly the moment Grandmaster de Valet's dwindling garrison needs every sword it can get. The extra days bought by Mustafa Pasha's costly hesitation, combined with a defense that never fully breaks the way it once did, shave crucial time off an already exhausted Ottoman timetable, time that in the history everyone else knows ran out just barely in the defenders' favor, and now runs out with a little more room to spare. Malta survives, as it always did, but it survives having bled less and having buried fewer of the men who were supposed to have no names left to remember by autumn. Somewhere in a modern Special Forces archive, a training exercise log exists describing an unexplained 18-hour gap off the coast of Sicily, and an equipment loss report accounting for 3 consumed javelin rounds and 2 names that no current roster can fully explain. No one who reads that file will ever believe where those 2 men actually died. Some fortresses are remembered because everyone inside them died holding the line. This one gets remembered a little differently, because for once, not everyone had to. What last stand should we rewrite next? Should American paratroopers hold a frozen crossroads a full winter before the record says they were ever there? Or should a company of Marines stand where an ancient wall was never supposed to survive its final morning? Drop your wildest scenario in the comments. Hit that hack button to help this video reach more people. Subscribe for the next battlefield, and I'll see you on the wall.